Joining us now on the line from New York, New York, Joel Simon. He's executive director of a group called the Committee to Protect Journalists. And we're happy to have you on the line from the Big Apple today. Joel, how are you?
I'm great, and it's great to be on.
Pleasure. Why don't you just start by telling us what your committee does?
Well, we defend the rights of journalists working all over the world in repressive and dangerous environments. We're an organization of journalists that uses the tools of journalism to ensure that our colleagues are able to work freely without fear of reprisal.
You just issued a report suggesting that there are too many journalists still in prison around the world. Why don't you put some more meat on the bone of that? What else did you say in your report?
Well, what we said, in fact, is that the number of journalists in jail around the world is up sharply in the last year. There are 179 journalists in jail all over the world. Iran is the leading jailer of journalists, followed by Eritrea, a very repressive country in the Horn of Africa, China, Burma, Vietnam, Turkey, Syria, all are featured on this list of shame.
What accounts for the jump in journalists going to jail, in your view?
Well, most of the increase is in the Middle East, and there's no question that the events relating to the Arab Spring have created an environment in which repressive governments in that region are very afraid of the power of information. They understand that unless they can control information, their regimes are threatened. And so you're seeing a horrendous crackdown in Syria, obviously, where the government is under siege and has rounded up many journalists and kept international reporters out of the country. And Iran also, while it's not, the events there are not directly related in any way to the Arab Spring, it recognizes, it's seeing what's happening in the region and recognizes that independent information threatens that government. And so there's an ongoing crackdown in Iran. 42 journalists are in jail in that country. Many are being held in prison under horrific conditions. And Iran has become the world's leading jailer of journalists as a result.
I'm not sure that will come as a surprise to many Canadians, because we remember a woman named Sarah Kazemi, who was Canadian and who was killed while in prison in Iran. But for example, Turkey, we're hearing so many good things about Turkey these days, that it is a society which is increasingly westernizing and increasingly respectful of civil rights. What's it doing on the list?
Well, Turkey is a very complex country, and in fact, we classified 8 journalists in jail in Turkey as a result of their work, but many groups have a much higher number. And the reason is that the situation is so murky. The judicial process is opaque. There are broad crackdowns on independent expression in Turkey. This is a government that is intolerant of critical reporting, and there's ongoing repression of Kurdish separatists. Some of those separatists are obviously linked to violent movements, but there's also peaceful expression of Kurdish sentiment, and journalists who echo those sentiments are facing broad repression as well. So Turkey, certainly there's economic growth. It's a society which is very dynamic, but it remains very repressive.
Are there any countries, Joel, that, having looked at them this year, you've noticed they're doing much better than in years past?
Well, what I think is really interesting is that there is not one journalist in prison in all of the Americas. And this is the first time since we've been compiling that list that there has not been a journalist in jail somewhere in Latin America or in North America. That is certainly good news. One reason is that Cuba, which has appeared on this list year after year, which rounded up dozens of journalists in 2003 in a crackdown that became known as the Black Spring, has released every one of those imprisoned journalists. There are no journalists in jail in Cuba. That's certainly good news. However, Cuba remains a highly repressive country and one of the most censored countries in the world. So the overall environment remains repressive, but it's certainly very positive news that there are no journalists in jail.
I don't mean this question to sound snotty or elitist, but when we're talking about journalists here, I want to understand whether you're making a distinction between somebody who's in Tahrir Square for the New York Times and somebody who's blogging for their own blog. Are they both journalists as far as you're concerned and as far as the list is concerned?
Absolutely. We've always been an organization that recognizes that journalism is an activity. and that the medium through which it is exercised has changed because of technology. We're on television. When television first emerged, there were a lot of people who thought, oh, television, that's not a medium through which journalism can be accomplished, and this is a grave threat to print journalism. And so every time new technologies emerge, there's a debate about whether journalism can be, it can be a vehicle for journalism. There is no question that the internet, blogs, social media have become a viable and growing means through which journalists do their work. It has allowed informal citizen journalists to participate in the process of gathering and disseminating news and information, and we absolutely recognize their role and include them on this list.
Well, if you are including them, then that obviously means that there are many, many, many more journalists today in harm's way than there would have been in the past. So if you take everything in proportion, are we doing better or worse today when it comes to press freedom?
It is a very, very complex picture. The way in which people who want to understand the world, gather, and have access to information has changed dramatically. We have so many more vehicles and means of accessing information, and yet the diffuse environment has created enormous economic challenges for traditional media. So there's less resources, less foreign correspondence. So it's a very, very complex environment, and there are certainly more journalists than ever, and there are ways of accessing information that were not previously available. But the overall environment is, it's really, you have to go country by country, you have to go situation by situation to make a valid judgment.
One thing that interested me about the list you gave at the beginning, Iran, Eritrea, China, Burma, Vietnam, Turkey, Syria is the first Middle Eastern country I see on the list, and one would have thought with the Arab Spring and in many more Arab countries, we would see many more numbers of journalists going to jail. Is that in fact the case? They're just not that high up on the list, but in fact the Arab Spring resulted in a lot of imprisonment in a lot of different Arab countries?
Well, the Arab Spring definitely resulted in a lot of imprisonment. There are there's still a couple of bloggers in jail in Egypt, for example. But you have to understand that traditionally the Arab media has not been terribly aggressive, and that there have been complex means of control and management of the media that include government appointments of editors, relationships. There's lots. If you're a journalist or an editor in traditionally places like Egypt and Tunisia or Saudi Arabia today, for that matter, you're going to have lots of tea or coffee with government officials, and they're going to kind of let you know informally the kinds of things they'd like to see you report and not report. That's a pretty effective way of controlling what's in the media, and it's much less visible and much less repressive. When you see large numbers of journalists being carted off to jail, it means these governments are under siege. It means their backs are against the wall, and they're using even more repressive measures than they would normally employ because they feel so vulnerable and so threatened.
Let me ask you about a country that we focused on last night. We're in the middle of what we call Countries Week here on TVO, where we're putting the spotlight on a number of different countries which are in the news for different reasons. We talked about Mexico. Many Canadians, I suspect, don't know that almost 50,000 people have been killed in Mexico over the last number of years because of the drug war there. Are Mexican journalists going to jail in large numbers?
No. I was a journalist for many years in Mexico. That was the country that I covered when I was a foreign correspondent, so I'm very familiar with the situation there. I have many friends, and I'm frankly very, very alarmed about what's happening in Mexico. The thing that people don't realize, Mexico, from a political perspective, is very open. When I was a journalist in Mexico, you could get in trouble for criticizing the government, doing investigative stories, for example. That's no longer the case. There's a lot of tolerance for kind of political debate, criticism of government policies. What gets you in trouble in Mexico, and it's not the kind of trouble where somebody arrests you, it's where somebody puts a bullet in your head. And that's reporting on the drug cartels, particularly in areas of the country along the border and major regional cities that are practically under the sway of these cartels. These cartels are running the city halls. They've taken over the media. They've told journalists what they can and cannot write. And in some parts of Mexico, self-censorship is so pervasive that there could be a gunfight in the middle of the street in downtown, and you would pick up the newspaper or turn on the radio, and you wouldn't hear about it because journalists are absolutely terrified to report news and information that everyone in these cities is witnessing.
Well, we also know another country that's dangerous to your health if you try to do journalism provocatively is Russia. You can get a bullet in the head there as well. What's the status of things in Russia these days?
Well, Russia is undergoing a very interesting transformation as well. The way it's generally worked in Russia is the Kremlin has controlled mass media, and it has tolerated critical journalism in media that doesn't reach large numbers of people. The print media in Moscow, for example, are online. But what's happened that's a real threat to the government there is that the internet has become a form of mass media. And more people in Russia are online and getting their news and information that way, particularly the middle class in Moscow, who are now out protesting. And they have lost confidence in the sort of national broadcast media. And what's interesting is that the broadcast media is now catching up, is now recognizing that in order to have any credibility, they have to cover these political developments. So this is a crossroads for Russia in terms of information policies. You could see it become more repressive, you could see a crackdown, or this could become the beginning of an opening.
And Joel, let's finish off on this. I think you told me at the beginning 179 journalists in jails around the world. Could you speak to those people who would say, look, at 179, I mean, if you're one of them, that's terrible. But if you think about the amount of misery in the world today, that's not a huge number. All in all, journalists ought to be thankful that they're doing relatively well. What would you say to people who held that view?
Well, I'd say it's not I'm a journalist, so I have a personal interest. These are my colleagues. Some of them are my friends that are in jail. I care on a personal level very much about them. But on a broader level, I think they're in the business of providing information, of informing the public, not only within their own societies, but globally. And the imprisonment of 40 journalists in Iran or 9 in Syria or what have you has a pervasive impact on the ability of the media to perform its basic function of gathering and disseminating information. So if you care at all about what is happening in these countries, if you want to follow developments, if you want to be informed, then you have a stake in ensuring that journalists are able to do their job freely, and they cannot do that if they are facing repression and imprisonment merely for telling the truth.
That's a good answer. Joel, thanks for coming on TVO tonight. We appreciate your time.
It's been a pleasure.